Well, Alex, thank you very much for being with us today. You have recently published your book, Grow the Pie, and your book presents this and goes to great length at describing these two different, I would say, attitudes toward facing issues that are important when we need to make decisions. The pie splitting mentality and the grow the pie mentality. Could you please elaborate on them and explain to us, maybe give a couple examples of how these apply to our decisions?
Sure, and before I start, thanks Julio for inviting me. It's great to be here. So what do I mean by the pie splitting mentality? So the traditional way that managers think about how to run their businesses is they view that the value that their company creates as being given by a pie, and the size of that pie is fixed. And typically managers think they should maximize profits for their investors. So if the pie is fixed, the only way to increase the slice, which goes to investors in the form of profits, is by reducing the slice that goes to other people. This might be reducing worker wages or polluting the environment or getting away with as little tax as possible. And indeed, that's how managers do run some of their businesses, which is why there's a lot of mistrust in capitalism. So why is the book called Grow the Pie? Well, what it's trying to argue based on evidence is that actually if you run business with an alternative objective, which is to create value for society, so treat workers better, make products that genuinely satisfy social problems, doing so doesn't sacrifice profits. You're not giving up pie to society. It in fact grows the pie. It creates value for society, but also creates more profits for investors. So that's a different way of running business, but it's not one which is just sort of fluffy and tree huggy. It's actually going to generate greater profits in the long term.
Great, thanks, Alex. So I guess going big picture on some of these issues, there's some very important forces in our society. I'm thinking income inequality, technological change. How do you see, or do you see these forces as playing a role in the sort of like pie splitting, grow the pie mentality across individuals and organizations?
Yes, I absolutely do, because there's one approach which is, okay, there's these problems like income inequality, automation and climate change, but if indeed it's the company's responsibility to make profits for investors, it should ignore those social problems. So it should just not necessarily use the least packaging, doesn't need to worry about its carbon emissions, just go after profit. But that would only work actually in the short term, because in the long term, such an approach actually will shrink the pie. Why? Because if businesses are going to be polluting the environment, there's going to be heavy regulation, and that regulation will hurt profits in the long term. So in fact, if a company is going to take seriously its impact on workers or its impact on environment, then actually that's good business sense. So investors will benefit in the long term. Why? Because customers and workers are more likely to go to a company which treats the environment better. And also we're not going to have anti-business regulation. So these things are serious, right? We had Extinction Rebellion making some very big demands, and that goes to the idea that actually the general public and citizens are not happy with the way in which business is conducted. One of the reasons why there's Brexit in my own country, the UK, is people don't trust capitalism. And many people think Brexit will be bad for companies. So indeed, you can see the revolt of citizens if they think that companies are not addressing these social problems.
Yeah, so thanks, Alex. So going, I guess, to our to issues that are more prescient and more very part of our the way companies are run in Latin America. So what and maybe within some of the interest groups, I'm thinking about investors and different types of investors. So one thing that is fairly common in our companies is to have a controlling shareholder. So our investor group has different could have different objectives. So I'm thinking the different investor groups, and now that we're having lots of companies with financial difficulties, I'm thinking, well, there's the shareholders, and there's the debt holders, and there's the suppliers to some extent, which sometimes behave as investors in some situations. how do you feel? Do you think a grow the pie approach to the issues that different investors are facing right now could help these companies make better decisions and avoid some of the possible mistakes that they may run into in these turbulent times?
Yeah, so I think the application to Latin American countries is very interesting because, as you say, they're characterized by a controlling shareholder, and outside shareholders tend to have less power. Now, interestingly, there are people within the UK and the US who say, well, that's actually good because what they're saying is, well, the short-term investors, you don't want them to be involved with company decision-making because they're just going to pursue profit at the expense of serving wider society. But again, that view is incorrect because that view assumes the fixed pie mentality. It assumes that outside investors will try to create profits by hurting workers and hurting the environment. When in fact, the book gathers a lot of large-scale evidence showing that actually outside shareholders are much better for a company in the long term than otherwise thought. So they indeed try to make the company more profitable, but not by treating workers badly and polluting the environment, but by just making the company more productive. So then how does that apply to Latin American companies? Is that actually having outside shareholders is often seen as good governance. So if you have controlling shareholders, or in particular, pyramidal structures where you have a separation of cash flow rights from control rights, that's not necessarily a good thing because you want to have outside oversight of company management. Like we often think, like company management, they're entrepreneurs, let them do what they want to and just stop pesky outsiders from interfering. But a good car has both accelerator and brake pedals, right? You do want the vision of the entrepreneur, but you also do want some outside oversight. And so one of the challenges is to have the ideas of outside shareholders which are influencing management decisions, even in controlling structures.
Yeah. So I guess going back to these big trends or big events in society, and thinking now in pie splitting beyond business. What do you think? Do you see as lessons for society at large? Because we see all these tensions. Like so, we have the colleagues, the people who work who are suffering now, probably a large share of the initial impact by being layoffs or job suspensions, and you have governments and you have all these really big tensions between that maybe have the potential of pushing people into a pie splitting mentality. This becoming kind of short-termist in their approach. But there's more after this. So eventually we're going to beat these health problems, and then we have to. There's a life after this that we need to prepare for, and we have to keep our eyesight there. What do you think will be sort of like beneficial a beneficial approach towards the really big challenges that we're facing right now that could be illuminated by some of the issues that you cover in your book?
Yeah, thanks. So one of the most fundamental concepts in the economics is the idea of an externality. So an externality is an impact that you have on wider society, which doesn't directly affect yourself. But one of the key themes of the book is that many things that we think of as externalities actually eventually get internalized and affect us. For example, if a company treats its workers well, right, sometimes people think, well, you're just throwing money at workers. But one of my own papers finds that, well, those companies actually deliver higher shareholder returns in the long term. So what does that mean in the current crisis? Well, you do have some companies who need to let their workers go. And absolutely, that is often the commercial decision. So my book is not arguing companies should never make workers redundant. If you're in the travel sector, you do need to downsize, otherwise you're just going to be uncompetitive. But what it does mean is that you should do that in a humane way. Right? Rational economic models will say, once you're getting rid of a worker, you don't need to care about them, so treat them as badly as possible. But that has huge reputational consequences. So let's take Airbnb, for example. They needed to get rid of their workers because the travel industry has taken a hit, but they did so in a really humane way. So they made sure that workers got, I believe, at least 14 weeks of severance pay, which was way higher than the legal minimum. They kept their health insurance for a year. And they also kept their laptop, which is really important to help them find a new job. And that might eventually help Airbnb in the long term, right? Because the workers who haven't been made redundant, they will be more motivated knowing that their friends who've lost their job are going to be well treated. Customers, potential travelers will want to go to a company which is more ethical and so forth. So even though I truly believe Airbnb did those things out of humanity, rather than calculating it's going to help our reputation, eventually those positive externalities will help it in the long term because it will affect reputation and employee motivation and customers being willing to go to them and so forth.
So this is the I'm going to go in a more research-oriented question. So some of the when we study things like ESG or grow the pie type of aspects, there's always the issue of chicken and egg, or was this thing caused by something else? How do you tackle the causality question in this research on grow the pie approach to business problems?
Yeah, so that's really important because otherwise, without research, everything that I've said could be like wishful thinking. What I've said, if companies treat society better, then they do better. That sounds too good to be true. And even if we found a correlation, it might not be causation. So is it treating society better leads to better financial returns? Or only once you have better financial returns can you think about treating society better? So how did I address that in particular in my study of employee satisfaction, where you don't know what causes what? So if I was to do a correlation between employee satisfaction and profitability, you would indeed have that problem. Is it employee satisfaction improves profits? Or once you have high profits, you can improve employee satisfaction. So instead of looking at profitability, I looked at future stock returns. So how does that get around the issue? Well, the future stock return is the change in the stock price between now and next year. So if a company was already profitable, and that's why the employees were happy, its starting stock price would already be high, and so it wouldn't expect any higher returns going forwards because the starting point is already high. Now, obviously, you have to do more complicated things than that. You need to control for momentum, the fact that maybe the current stock price doesn't fully incorporate the short-term profits, but there are ways that finance is established of trying to address things like momentum. So that's sort of the idea. There's more specifics that are actually in the book as to other things that I do, but there's a lot of techniques that I try to do in order to try to reduce the likelihood that it was causality in the wrong direction.
So I have one last question for our researchers who will be in the audience. So you're the managing editor of one of the leading finance journals, and I wanted to ask you, what do you see are areas of research related to these issues that are in the greatest need of a good research?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think one of the real challenges is trying to look at the effect of, say, purposeful business on long-term return. So often people are saying now purpose is what a company needs to have. Larry Fink has come out in every January writing a letter to CEOs arguing they should be more purposeful. But nobody has really measured purpose, right? So my study looks at an outcome. It looks at employee satisfaction. Other people have looked at things like shareholder proposals for ESG, but purpose is something really difficult to measure. So it may well be that you need a smart person to look inside the organization and get some data for entrepreneurship to look at some measures which are not publicly available. So I think it's going to be something difficult to look at publicly using publicly available sources. I also think that some nuances is important because some people, particularly some practitioners and authors, they like to give the impression that responsibility always pays off, that companies should always treat society well. But reality is much more nuanced than that. Sometimes it will work and sometimes it won't work. And to understand the situations in which you should care about society, and then the other situations in which, no, we should focus on profits for survival, something like that I think is important. So something which is less one size fits all, but tailored to a company's individual circumstances.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. It's been great talking to you. We're very much looking forward to next Tuesday's session with our students. So thank you very much. Hope you have a very great week. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Julio, and thank you for inviting me to give the webinar next Tuesday. And so I'll be talking about the book, what it means for responsible business, in particular in Latin America, and also there'll be a lot of time for Q&A at the end, so for any attendees to ask me some questions. Thank you.
Right. Thanks.